Okay, I want to talk a little bit about social transmission of prejudice. In other words, how we pass down prejudices from one generation to the other, or sometimes how prejudices can just come up in social interactions. I want to talk a little bit before I begin talking about anything else about the woman you see in the bottom right corner. That is Jane Elliott. She was a elementary school teacher, and she did an experiment with her class. Her class was composed of white students, and she did an experiment where she told them that um, brown-eyed children were not as smart as blue-eyed children. And then the next day, she switched it up. She said that blue-eyed children were not as smart as brown-eyed children. Mind you, that before she did any of that, she openly told them that they were going to try this out. And it didn't change the fact that almost immediately after she made the claim, brown-eyed children are not as smart as blue-eyed children, the dynamics of the class changed, and all of a sudden, the brown-eyed children were treated more poorly, and um, not only that, but of course, the uh, brown-eyed children started to do more poorly in their assignments and in the games that they were playing. When she switched it up the next day, the same thing happened. Almost immediately, the blue-eyed children were scrutinized. They were kind of mistreated by the other children. And when it was their turn to play and to do assignments, they did worse than the brown-eyed children. Again, that goes back to the idea of that stereotype threat. And of course, it reinforces the idea that discrimination can be passed down very simply, especially to children, by just word of mouth. Children hear their parents say things, they hear the adults, the teacher say things, do things, and then they think that that is correct. And it also plays into the in group, out group dynamic that we all naturally have. We all naturally have this feeling that our group, the in group, or the group that we belong to, is better, that we are all different, that sure, in my in group, there might be some dumb people, but there are also smart people. Yeah, there might be some bad people, but there's also good people. People kind of think that their in group is more heterogeneous, and almost any aspect of social dynamic has this in group, out group bias where we kind of just emotionally feel that our in group is better. And in childhood, that dynamic is really strong. Boys tend to think they're better than girls. Girls tend to think that they're better than boys. And anytime an adult reinforces that, then it just sort of creates that dynamic. We also tend to think that the out group is more homogenous, that they're all the same. They all think the same, they all act the same. Now, we may know that that is not the case, and yet a lot of times we behave and we feel, we treat people from the out group as if though it is the case. And it's not just about race and gender. We can create this dynamic almost out of nothing. We create it, you see it every day in sports, and how seriously some people take sports, and how seriously some people take their team pride. Religion often falls into this dynamic, but we can create it out of anything. You'll notice the Robbers Cave study. They took some children in a summer camp, in a sleepaway summer camp, and they split them up. All of the Eagles, that was group one, sort of spent time only with the Eagles, and they never saw the Rattlers, which was group two. The Rattlers were kept separate, and the only time they came to interact was when they were competing. And of course, when we create any kind of competition, that will add to that in group, out group dynamic where we start to sort of feed into the negative stereotypes. And sure enough, that's what happened between the Eagles and the Rattlers. It wasn't very long before all of the Eagles hated all of the Rattlers and vice versa. In the next part of the study, they brought the Eagles and the Rattlers together, and they were closer to each other. They interacted more, but they didn't really interact in a positive way. In fact, they kind of went out of their way to keep away from each other. And if ever an eagle and a rattler tried to make a friendship, they were sort of attacked by their own groups um, to stop interacting with the opposing team. In order to stop that kind of animosity, that kind of bias, a few things have to be created. First of all, you have to create ties where both groups need each other in order to accomplish a task. It's only when you can kind of put both teams together to accomplish a task where they depend on each other that you can start to erase those in group, out group biases and prejudices that have formed because of that social dynamic. Now, when you think about that in terms of sort of the real world, you can see how easily and how naturally the real world lends itself to creating these dynamics. We fight for resources, we fight for jobs, for positions within a company. And because of social learning and because of history, a lot of times we split ourselves off based on ethnic groups, based on ethnic identity and gender and sexual orientations. And then all of a sudden, we create these dynamics where we're competing for things that we don't have to really compete for. There are enough jobs for everyone, at least in this country, there are. And yet we have this dynamic where we sort of fight for certain positions, certain jobs. And when those happen in line with some of these groups, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, um, all of a sudden it can reinforce some of those learned biases, learned stereotypes and prejudices that we didn't put there ourselves. We didn't stick that into our brain. It was society that stuffed that into our brain. And yet here comes life and the dynamic of the social group to sort of reinforce that. Now, it is important to point out that in the same way that society can reinforce those behaviors and feelings, it can also punish them. And you see this a lot with younger people. Sometimes a young person is raised to have more biases, more prejudices, but when they get to the world, when they get to school, they meet friends who are of different races, of different religions, different sexual orientations, and they also meet friends that are like them, similar to them, that are not racist or bigoted. And when they say or do something racist or bigoted, they are punished through sort of that social awareness, like, oh, you can't say that. That's really horrible. And that is a way to break that, especially when it's not done as a way to sort of diminish or make somebody feel bad, but to sort of bring them up and teach them what is sort of okay and not okay. Now, another important aspect of prejudice is what is sometimes called the scapegoat theory. It's very easy to look at any social group that is a minority and blame society's ills on that group. And all throughout history, almost without fail, all throughout history, there are groups that have been demonized and sort of scapegoated for issues that had nothing to do with them. Diseases. Sometimes people say that social group, that ethnic group is the one that brought that disease. or oh, it's that social group that is perverted. Oh, they're stealing our jobs, that social group. It's very easy to scapegoat small groups because, of course, small groups don't have a large voice. And so, um, unfortunately, it's not only very easy to blame them, it is very easy because of some of the issues that we already talked about: in group, out group dynamic, out group homogeny bias, unequal resources. It's very easy for the average person to just accept that as true. Oh, yeah, that minority group must be the one that's doing this. If they weren't, why would our leaders say that it was them? And sure enough, all throughout history, you get incredibly horrible historical events of minority groups being hurt, being pushed out or away from society because they were scapegoated. Now, when we talk about reducing prejudice, there are a few ways that really work. Contact hypothesis suggests that if you're closer to people who are different from you, you are going to be less likely to have biases against them. And that's kind of true to a point. If you don't have these learned biases from childhood, it's going to be harder for someone to convince you that Joey, the guy you know, or Brenda, that lady you know, are bad somehow because you've seen them and you know them and you're not going to accept that. But if you already have some of these biases, even if they're unconscious, mere contact isn't really going to help with that because what ends up happening is you pay attention to the things that reinforce your biases. If you have a prejudice that group X is loud, when you see someone from group X be loud, that reinforces your prejudice. But when you see someone from group X who's actually quiet and they don't really bother anyone, you don't even notice them. You don't pay attention to them. And so it doesn't really affect how you think about that group. In order to really change that dynamic, you have to create other things. You have to change the social structure in order to make it work. As I mentioned earlier, when groups need each other, that helps to break down the prejudice. And more specifically, not only when they need each other, but if there's superordinate goals where now it's not just that we need to get together to um, complete this task, is that you have some skills that I don't have, and I have some skills that you don't have. And so neither of us, if we do it alone, will never accomplish this task. We need each other. That really helps to break down barriers. Also, when there are equal playing fields, right? When there are the people who are different from you are also similar to you in the playing field. Um, if not, then it just lends to more in-group, out-group dynamic, right? If all of the workers, let's say, are African American and all of the managers are white, well, you know what? Workers and managers are their own separate groups. And so what ends up happening is all the things that you tend to think about the managers becomes very easy to then just say, well, the managers, yeah, and also because they're all white. And everything the managers think about workers, they think, yeah, the workers, but also because they're all black. Um, as opposed to when you have equal footing, right? Some of the workers are African American, some of the workers are white, some of the managers are African American, some of the managers are white. You are working shoulder to shoulder with people who are different from you in this scenario racially, but you are working together sort of shoulder to shoulder. That helps to break down the dynamic. Otherwise, the playing field sort of will damage the desire for homogeny. Now, also, when the interactions are informal, but also hospitable and free from negative interaction. So when everything is formal, it's very easy for you to tell yourself, the only reason I'm being nice to this person is because I'm being forced to, because it's a formal event. Otherwise, I wouldn't be so nice to them. When it's informal, you don't have that excuse. And so you have to tell yourself, well, the reason I'm being nice to this person is because they're worthy of being respected. And I know that that sounds crazy, that your behavior is going to affect the way you think. We usually think about it the opposite way. The way I think influences my behavior. But the reality is that it goes both ways. And sometimes your behavior, if I take out the excuse of formality, your brain just has to come up with another reason. And the other reason is a lot less prejudice, right? You go, oh, the reason I am being kind is because this person is worthy of respect. The same thing is true with, the informal event being hospitable and free from negative interactions. Again, if you already have negative stereotypes and prejudices, whenever you see something negative occur, whether it's their fault or not, it's very easy for your own prejudices to go, oh, yeah, you see those people, that's why they are treated the way they're treated, is because they act like this or like that. And whether it's true or not, right? Whether those people really did the thing that you're accusing them of, it doesn't matter. Your own prejudices will allow you to do that. But when the event is hospitable, when it's free from negative interactions, it allows your brain to sort of check itself and go, oh, that's right. Yeah, these are just stereotypes, and these people are real people, individuals, and they all, behave differently. And in this scenario, look at how wonderful everybody was. Um, Now, it's also important that the contact lasts for a significant amount of time. Just like formality, if you only have to be nice to someone for a few hours a day or a few months, it's easier, again, for your brain to say, yeah, well, I just have to put up with them for these few months. Whereas when it's longer, when it's, years or whatever, your brain then goes, oh, yeah, the Thompsons, of course, I've known them for years. They're lovely people, because your brain doesn't have the ability to compartmentalize the reason you're behaving this way, right? Um, and then, of course, the idea that norms should promote harmony and mutual respect. This is especially true in events that are being put together at work, at school, at church, where there is this push, or there should be a push by the leaders to promote harmony and mutual respect. Because, of course, harmony and mutual respect lead directly to hospitable situations that are free from negative interactions. And so when you have these dynamics sort of in play, those tend to break down stereotypes. Um, Contact alone really isn't as good, not by itself at least, as creating a social situation that lends itself to harmony.